Good morning. This video lesson is all about three forms of conditional propositions. Its objective is to illustrate the different forms of conditional proposition. So before we go to the three different forms of conditional propositions, let us first have a little review about what conditional proposition is. So a conditional proposition with a symbol P arrow Q is read as P implies Q or if P, then Q. So a conditional proposition is presented when two simple propositions are connected using the word if, then, and are sometimes called if-then statements. So the if part there is the hypothesis and the then part is called the conclusion. So there are three propositions that can be derived from the conditional P implies Q. The first one is the inverse, which is the negation of both the hypothesis and the conclusion. That is why we have this symbol. Not P implies not Q. Next one is the converse, which is the interchange of the hypothesis and the conclusion. That is why its symbol is Q implies P. And lastly, we have the contrapositive, which is both the interchange and negation of the hypothesis and the conclusion. That is why its symbol is not Q implies not P. So let us go to our first example, which is if two lines are perpendicular, then they form right angles. So we have here a conditional proposition or an if-then statement, right? First thing we need to do is to identify our hypothesis and our conclusion. And we are aware that P is our hypothesis, the if statement is our hypothesis, and the then statement is our conclusion. So our hypothesis here is perpendicular, while our conclusion is that they form right angles. So our first form of conditional proposition is the inverse. And we all know that, as I've said or discussed a while ago, an inverse proposition, in order to get that, we only have to negate both hypothesis and conclusion. Therefore, our inverse proposition, its inverse proposition of this conditional proposition is that if two lines are not perpendicular, then they do not form right angles. If we negate hypothesis and conclusion, all we have to do is to put the word not. That is why our inverse is if two lines are not perpendicular, then they form or they do not form right angles. Next is the converse. So we have Q implies P. All we have to do is to interchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. So our hypothesis becomes our conclusion and vice versa. Therefore, what is our new hypothesis here? So if two lines form right angles, then they are perpendicular. We just have to interchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. That is the converse. And lastly, we have the contrapositive. So all we have to do in contrapositive is that we negate at the same time, we interchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. So therefore, our answer is if two lines do not form right angles, then they do not or they are not perpendicular. So you can see, we interchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. If statement becomes they form right angles, while then statement becomes perpendicular. and we added the not word because we have to negate them. So let us now proceed to our activity with conditional proposition statement of if the numbers is even, then it is divisible by 2. First thing you need to do is to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. What do you think is our hypothesis here? Okay, our hypothesis is if the number is even. How about our conclusion? Right. Then, it is divisible by 2 is our conclusion. So, can you give me the inverse of this statement? Right. So, our inverse is if a number is not even, then it is not divisible by 2. All we have to do is to negate both conclusion and hypothesis. So, how about the converse? In converse, all we have to do is to interchange both conclusion and hypothesis. Right. So our converse is if a number is divisible by 2, then it is even. How about contrapositive? All we have to do is to interchange and negate both hypothesis and conclusion. Correct. So our contrapositive is if a number is not divisible by 2, then it is not even. So, do you have any questions? Clarifications? If you have, feel free to PM me or message me directly in my Messenger or Facebook account, Princess Venerao. If you do not have questions, let us now proceed to our evaluation. So, for our evaluation part, please proceed to the link below. So, this link. So, this link will be sent in our group chat. And the Google form will stop receiving responses after 3 o'clock p.m. So, you do it and submit your work after 3 o'clock p.m. So, stay safe and God bless.